Coming up next is Karla Hammonds. She is a nurse practitioner, a singer, a wife, a mom, and a story that will touch your heart of how in one day she lost her son and saved 6 other lives. Here it is.
Luke was my oldest. His name was Christopher Luke, and he was he could light up any room. Zach was my youngest, and the two were very close. When Luke was 14, he came to me and held out his hand, and I held out my hand, and he dropped a .22 caliber bullet in it, and I said, what's that? And he said, that's what I was going to use to kill myself with. That's the first time that I ever knew that he was struggling in any way. I don't think that I was asking enough questions. It's like, for me, I just wanted to think, oh, if he goes to a counselor, he's going to be okay, and this will all be over with. And a few years went by. I put him into a military school. That's where he wanted to go, and I thought, this will be great, it'd be structure. But really, there was a part of it that was just relief for me, because it was now going to be somebody else to deal with this situation, because I felt kind of totally inadequate. And he was there for a couple of years, but ended up getting kicked out of the military school. He got kicked out and he came home, but by this time he'd been exposed to alcohol and drugs. That just further exacerbates mental illness, and so he ran away from home once when he was 17. I went and got him, and I took him to a different doctor, and at that point I remember the doctor said, Luke's going to need you for a long time. He's going to need, he's not going to be ready to go off to college next year. He's going to, need to be at home. And I really didn't understand what he was saying to me, but Luke just needed a lot of reinforcement, and really probably a lot of nurturing and a lot of just supervision. And so he was with us for about another year, and then an incident happened and he ran away again. And this time he was 18, and I couldn't get him to come home right away. And actually he fell into what he thought was modeling, but I've since learned that there's a group of people that target 18-year-old runaways. And so what he thought was modeling was really pornography and sex trafficking, if you will. And he was, put into a situation where he was given drugs and alcohol, and he was actually in a sexual situation with a person of the same sex. And so that was really devastating to him. And he called me and said he wanted to come home, that he didn't want to be, doing that anymore. And so, I was like, yes, come home. I know that's not what God wants for you. And again, I knew that that God could turn the situation around. But I think it's hard for an 18-year-old to feel that way, and just to have the maturity to realize that you can walk out of your past. And so Luke came home, and we had him, there with us for about 5 weeks before he took his own life. So that was the best 5 weeks that we ever had. So I was really thankful for those 5 weeks. The night that Luke shot himself, we knew that he was off somewhere, and he called me, and I could tell in his voice that it sounded like no other time I'd ever heard before. He was crying and very upset, and he said, I said, what's wrong? Come home. And he said, I can't come home. And I said, yes, you can come home. And he said, no. He said, I can't do this anymore. And he hung up, and I just knew in my heart, I was like, I think he's going to kill himself. And I tried to call him, and he didn't answer. And so I sent him a text, and I just said, I love you so much. And but something inside me just knew that he was serious. And so police were out, looking for him. And when they found him, of course, they came to the house to tell me. And it was the strangest thing. I remember that I said, they told me that they had found a male in a parking lot with a gunshot wound to the head. And my words were, does he have a heartbeat? And I'm not sure why I asked that, but I guess being a nurse, in my mind, I thought, if he has a heartbeat, he's still alive. And so they said yes, and they were taking him to the hospital. And so my husband at the time and I left and went, to the hospital. And on the way, they called and said that they wanted to life flight him to Vanderbilt in Nashville. And I remember that just right about a year before, when he turned 17, he needed to get a new license because we lived in a different state. And when I took him to get his license, they had a big sign about organ donation up. And he asked me what that was, and I said, if something were to happen to you or to me, then, they could take our organs because we wouldn't need them anymore, and they could use them to let somebody else live that had a failing organ. And he was like, what do you think of that? And I said, I think it's great. Once we die, we'll be in heaven. We don't need our bodies. He said, I want to do that. And I said, well, just tell the lady up there when you go to get your license, and she'll let you sign your card. And so he did. And so I just, remembered that he said he wanted to be an organ donor. And so when they told me they were going to life flight him, I said, please tell me the truth. Do you think that with his injury, that there's any way he can survive this with any quality of life? And the ER physician said, no, I don't. And I said, well, then will you keep him so that I can be with him? I said, if you send him to Nashville, I can't come and be with him. And so he said yes, that he would keep him and admit him. So he did, and I was able to go and be with him for the next 14 hours until someone came and pronounced him. And during that time, I thought, this is the worst possible outcome, and this is the worst day, but it's going to be 6 other people's best day. And that was me just being hopeful, thinking, they were telling me they could use, all organs. But now I understand that that's really a big deal for somebody to be able to be an organ donor. He donated 7 organs. One person had a double lung transplant. So 7 organs to 6 people, that's really a big deal because it's hard to find matches and all that quickly. So I know that God knew ahead of time that Luke was only going to be here for 18 years, and he had a plan to use his life in a big way. It just wasn't the plan that I thought. Losing Luke was super difficult, but at the time, I don't think I really understood how difficult it was. I obviously initially was in shock, and I can remember it physically hurting, but I didn't really deal with his death. I kept everything the same in his room, and I kept his car parked out front where he parked for a while until my husband made me sell it, but I really didn't want to. I just really kind of pretended like he was off at summer camp and like he was coming home. So that was difficult. And then just 18 months later, my husband died unexpectedly, and he had been there for me when Luke died. I just tried to focus on him and my other son and making them feel like they were enough for me to keep going. I actually didn't want them to see me cry. I didn't want to be real demonstrative in front of them because I was afraid that they would feel like they weren't enough for me to go on. I've since learned that's not really healthy, and God's put a lot of parents in my path that have lost children, and I always tell them, take the time you need to grieve and talk about it with other family members because they're grieving too. I know now that Zach was grieving. He missed his brother terribly and still does, and we talk about Luke all the time when he's with me, or his name always comes up because that was a huge part of our life. And so I tell people that if you need to spend a day in bed, spend a day in bed. If you need to fall down on the floor and writhe around and moan, do it. But you have to process the grief, and grief can really be a beautiful thing because it lets you know how much you loved someone. So losing Randy right after that was difficult because I hadn't even processed the first grief. So I had grief upon grief, and then 14 months later, my father died. So these 3 out of the 4 most important men in my life were gone in just a matter of a few years. And so I found myself kind of all alone with my grief. When Zach graduated and left off, he went to join the military, he went off to boot camp. I remember it was June of 2018, and I think I cried for a month because I just realized I was just here with all this grief, and I really didn't know what to do with it. And I didn't really want to live, I didn't want to take my own life and do that to my son, Zach. And I also didn't want to let Satan win because I think that, Satan is the author of death. He comes to kill, steal, and destroy. And so if I had taken my own life, I'd been cooperating with him. And one of my favorite verses is Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans not to harm you, plans to prosper you, plans to give you hope and a future. And so if that's God's plan not to harm me, then to harm myself wouldn't be God's plan. So I let that be sort of that driving force that said, okay, God, if you have a plan to prosper me, you got to help me walk out of this. And I just tried to do the next right thing. And sometimes that was get up and brush my teeth. Sometimes that was go to a job. Sometimes that was, laugh again. But it was just literally one step at a time, one day at a time of doing the next right thing. After, getting to a place where I realized, I can do this. God's equipped me to deal with grief and whatever else I come up against. I'm not going to let anybody get me down. When I least expected it, then God put somebody in my path, which is David, my husband now, and we kind of met through music, and I was kind of determined that I was, not really interested at first, but again, God's, many are the plans in a man's heart, but it's the Lord's purpose that will prevail. So, I realized after spending a good bit of time with him that he was my best friend, and so, I remember the particular day where the Lord just, told me, marry David, and so I'm thankful I did. I feel like I'm the happiest now that I've ever been in my life, and only God could do that after having had these kinds of losses in your life, and to feel more of a sense of peace and calmness now than I ever had before. And love to me it's a decision. It's a decision to make a commitment to somebody. I'm Karla Hammonds, and I am a woman of true grit.
For more inspiring stories like this, visit ediehan.com.